Hey, welcome back to my WHAP deep dive series. I'm Emily Glankler of Antisocial Studies. Hopefully, you've already been following along, and so you've already seen my Unit 1 overview and some of the other deep dives I've done. But this one is going to be a little bit more general than I normally do. And it's just on what tends to be the section of Unit 1 that students and teachers have the hardest time with, myself included, because a lot of this and a lot of these states are unfamiliar to us. So I'm just going to go in a little bit of an overview over South and Southeast Asia and the different states that you might want to know about from an AP world history standpoint. So again, before I start, I'm in no way an expert on South and Southeast Asian history. It's not something I ever learned about in school, which is why I'm super glad that AP World has it in the curriculum now, but it's also why a lot of teachers, when they saw those states, went, ooh, I've actually never heard of those before. So let's just go and talk about the few states that can serve as illustrative examples of some different trends happening in this region, which of course is sort of dominated by the Indian Ocean trade. So first, let's just talk about what we mean when we say South Asia. So a lot of times we call this India, and that's fine. Like it makes sense to us. We kind of know what that means. But really, India doesn't exist until the British make it exist in the 1800s. So one of the important things to understand about South Asia, which is today India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, is that it's a mess. And I don't mean a mess in a bad way. I just mean it's really almost it's never united until the British force it to be united in the 19th century. It is incredibly difficult to rule because it's so diverse. There's so many different ruling clans and princes and regions and different ethnic groups and different languages and even different kind of variations of Hinduism that are followed across the subcontinent. It is almost impossible for any state to truly actually control all of South Asia. So even when you're reading in your book and you see something like, oh, the Delhi Sultanate conquered all of South Asia, not really. They might have conquered it for like a year and then they lost it again. So, and that's going to happen throughout. When they talk about the Mughal Empire, that's really just in northern, what we think of today as India. So just keep that in mind as you go through the course. When you hear about states that exist that sound like these monoliths that like rule all of modern day India, no, that's basically impossible. So with that, let's just look. This is like in one slide what we kind of might want to know about from late post-classical South Asia. Essentially, the main state that you're probably going to learn about is the Delhi Sultanate, which is the first Islamic dynasty to come in and rule in South Asia. But again, what this map shows is that really they for the most part only rule northern India, and even that they rule it kind of tenuously. There are these other kingdoms called the Rajput kingdoms, which is again just a collection of different clans and groups that sort of rule each of their own small regions. So even in this map, even at the height of the Delhi Sultanate, they don't really actually control this part of northwestern today India. We also see that, yes, when we look at the tan, it's like they did control most of South Asia in 1335. But then what we see is like, but in literally the next year, they have to get moved back to this sort of red line because another empire comes in. One of the reasons is because they have to defend against the Mongol invasions from the north. So again, you have the Delhi Sultanate, which the leadership is Muslim. However, the population of South Asia always is predominantly Hindu. And the Delhi Sultanate and then the later Mughal Empire, which is going to replace it, both really only firmly rule the northern part of India. And at that point, even not so much when you have these different clans and kingdoms that also are semi-independent within it. Whew, it's a mess. In southern India today, southern South Asia, we have kind of two dynasties that get mentioned by at least the book that I use. The earlier one is called the Chola dynasties. Again, dynasties meaning it's kind of this familial rule. It's changing hands a lot, but they kind of rule the southern part of the subcontinent. They are going to have an impact on Southeast Asia, which we'll talk about in a second. They're going to have an impact on modern day Sri Lanka, which again, we'll talk about in a second. they get kind of taken away in this Delhi Sultanate, and then they kind of fall apart as well. And they're going to be replaced later by the Vijayanagara Empire, which is another powerful South Indian state that gets established and is going to really benefit from being just like right sticking out in the middle of the Indian Ocean trade route. And they're going to exist for about 300 years. So again, the general thing I want you to take away from this about South Asia is that no one state ever truly rules all of South Asia, even today, but that's a current events issue for another day. So now let's go to the part that really I think is very unfamiliar to a lot of people that grew up in at least the US education system, which is Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia obviously there's part that are kind of connected to the continent of Asia, which is modern day Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam. But then it's also this collection of islands, which today would be the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, so on and so forth. And honestly, we normally just talk about Southeast Asia in relation to the rest of Asia. We normally talk about them either in relation to India or in relation to China. And part of that is just because that's what dominated their history. They are going to rise, and they're going to have these powerful states and kingdoms that really rise just because they are in the middle, in between of these two really powerful trading regions of China, East Asia, and India or South Asia. So they capitalize on trade. They capitalize a lot of times on being sort of the guardians of a lot of these really narrow waterways and straits, where if ships want to get over to China, they have to go through a lot of these places. Obviously, until we discover we can just go around, but that's for a later date. And this is also going to make it a destination for a lot of merchants who then want to set up shop permanently. So a lot of these states, especially the island states, are going to become very diverse. So you're going to see a lot of what we call diasporic communities, meaning you'll see, even if it's predominantly like a Hindu kingdom or a Buddhist kingdom, you'll see probably a large population of Muslims set up, especially in the major trading cities. You'll see later on as well a lot of Jews and Jewish communities set up in the trading cities as merchants basically want to set up so that then they can trade back with their home state. And so that makes it really diverse, and that makes the kingdoms also very confusing. Similar to South Asia, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for someone or one state to control all of Southeast Asia. And so for the most part, these states and kingdoms are rising and falling and existing at the same time, sometimes in a way that's very fluid, but also very confusing for people who don't have a lot of background information on these different states and who don't spend a lot of time. I just spent the last 2 hours and I still don't feel like I truly understand any of these states, but I can give us at least the basics of what we need to know for AP World. Later on, these are going to be nicknamed by the Dutch and other European traders the Spice Islands, because not only are they important as kind of routes, they're kind of the guardians of these routes between the Indian Ocean and China, but they also are going to, they grow a lot of spices that later on, and even during this time, right, the Europeans begin to want. Okay, so what you really want to think about, I think the easiest way to approach these Southeast Asian kingdoms is to think about them in two parts. There's sea-based kingdoms and there's land-based kingdoms. And so sea-based kingdoms just mean, you know, a kingdom that rules mostly on these islands, and really the way that they rule is by dominating sea trade. A land-based kingdom is going to be a more traditional, it's typically like a farming kingdom that really benefits from trading the stuff they're growing and farming to the rest of the world. So let's first look at two sea-based kingdoms. The first is SRIVIJAYA. Let me move my head for a second so that I'm not blocking. Okay, so we have SRIVIJAYA, which is going to be based predominantly in Sumatra, which is kind of this island here, although as we can see, it's going to come out and influence a lot of other places. They are predominantly a Buddhist state. They have an enormous navy, as you can see, right, because they're able to send expeditions all the way up to China, the Gulf of Tonkin, expeditions all the way up into kind of the Khmer Empire, which we'll talk about in a second. They are almost constantly at war with South Asian states. So they're at war with the Chola kingdoms of the southern part of India. They're also going to be at war with their rival, the Majapahit or Majapahit, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. The Majapahit are going to be over here on this island. And again, they sort of rise and exist at the same time. The last prince of Srivijaya is going to first flee to what's modern day Singapore, and then eventually is going to establish the Sultanate of Malacca, which I'm going to do a whole deep dive just on that state in a few videos. So that's Srivijaya. It's Buddhist. It controls a lot of these waterways with this enormous navy. And it is kind of the main power in the early part of this time period, but then it's going to get somewhat replaced in importance by the Majapahit or Majapahit. So this state is based primarily on Java, which is going to be kind of like this island here, as opposed to this, which is where the Srivijaya were. And they really rule, whereas the Srivijaya have this enormous navy that they control, the Majapahit state controls with the help of sea nomads. So basically nomadic people who kind of live most of their life on boats. And they're often called sea gypsies, but that's not really a term that we use anymore. We now call them sea nomads. And so they're essentially what we might think of as pirates, except our idea of pirates is like super negative and people that are always going around and stealing other people's stuff. But essentially, they are kind of in control of a lot of these waterways. And so the Majapahit, they rule a little bit more indirectly. They set up 98 tributary states, which means there's hundreds of other states that are existing in Southeast Asia. And the Majapahit just becomes kind of the most powerful right here in its core area on the eastern half of Java. But they go out and they kind of assert their dominance over these other states who then pay them tribute. So it's a little bit more indirect rule as opposed to Srivijaya. They were actually founded after they defeated the Mongol navy. So the Mongols at this moment are ruling China up here, the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan. For context, if you're familiar with this other stuff, Marco Polo's traveling from Italy over to China, right? That's what's happening at this moment. And so the Mongols or the Yuan dynasty in China actually send a naval fleet to conquer this island, and the people and the different smaller states on this island defend, and then they set up a new capital at the village of Majapahit. They get visited later on by Zheng He from the Ming dynasty, but they're going to decline in power when the Ming dynasty starts to support the Sultanate of Malacca, which is their trading rival. So again, we sort of have this back and forth between the island of Sumatra, the island of Java, and essentially it's this constant power struggle. And really, whoever is going to come out on top is typically the one that is being backed by China. Okay, so those are two sea-based kingdoms you'd want to know. You might notice this one I said is Hindu, in parentheses, also Buddhist. This can be really confusing for a lot of people, but essentially Hinduism and Buddhism, there are ways that those two can coexist in a state at the same time. So we see in the Majapahit kingdom that there's two different sort of variations of Hinduism and then one variation of Buddhism that all coexist on the island. It's generally considered the last great Hindu kind of Southeast Asian empire, though. So primarily, we might identify it as Hindu. But again, if we're talking about diversity and syncretism and all these different things that are happening in Southeast Asia, just the fact that this state is identified as a Hindu-Buddhist state would be evidence of that. Okay, now I'm going to talk about two land-based kingdoms. And by land-based, I just mean that their power is predominantly from the land. So whereas Srivijaya and Majapahit, their power came predominantly from the sea, controlling those trading routes. These two are a little bit more traditional. They're either self-sufficient, like the Sinhala dynasties, or they're going to be kind of producing crops and producing things to trade with others, like the Khmer that we'll talk about in a second. So the Sinhala dynasties essentially just rule what we know of today as Sri Lanka. And I want us to notice how long these Sinhala dynasties ruled for. Now, there's constant change in the dynasties. During this time period, there's maybe 6, 7, or 8 that rule, but they exist in some form from 543 BCE, before the year 0, all the way up to 1815, when they're going to get essentially conquered and taken over by the British and named Ceylon. Side note, This year might be a little bit of a stretch because this happens to be the year of the Buddha's death. And so this might be part of sort of the myth of the founding of this, powerful Buddhist kingdom in Sri Lanka, is that they sort of set the start date. They basically said that the first king arrived in Sri Lanka on the day of the Buddhist death. So is that exactly true? Maybe. That'd be like a really crazy and cool coincidence. But this might be a little bit of like an ish sort of date, right? So they're ruled by the Sinhalese ethnic group for the first half. Later, they're going to be ruled by the Tamil ethnic group, which is still kind of an ethnic minority in Sri Lanka. They are Buddhist, and they really claim their power from being a Buddhist state. In fact, one of their most important, or really their most important relic that they have that will go on to become a symbol of their political power is the tooth relic of the Buddha. So essentially, when the Buddha died, he was cremated. The story goes that one of his followers took a tooth from the ashes and then brought it down to these Sinhalese dynasties. And so essentially what happens is that each ruler or each new dynasty, they'll set up their capital in wherever their home city or village is, and then they will move the tooth relic to that place to sort of symbolize that this is where the new center of power is. And so it's kind of an interesting and unique example of this idea of like a mandate from heaven, or the divine right to rule that's kind of tied to this very physical object that's believed to be a relic of Siddhartha Gautama. They never expand beyond the island of modern Sri Lanka. They're constantly competing with these other southern kind of Indian states, but they are essentially self-sufficient, except for salt. They have to trade for salt from, South Asia, but otherwise they're sort of able to exist on their own. They never become incredibly powerful in the region, but again, they exist in some form or fashion until the 19th century, which is pretty amazing. Okay, the last kingdom that you might want to know about is the Khmer Empire. This is just a massive and kind of amazing empire that exists in mostly modern day Cambodia. It's also sometimes called the Angkor Kingdom because its capital city was Angkor. And Angkor Wat is sort of a temple, and the main temple and palace complex in the city of Angkor. So the Khmer are Hindu-Buddhist. What that means here is that they're founded as a Hindu kingdom. They are still predominantly Hindu. However, at some point around midway through their rule, the leadership converts to Buddhism. That's actually going to be one of the reasons why they slowly decline, is because Hinduism provides a lot of social stability because there's a lot of structure there. There were a lot of traditions, a lot of social hierarchy that was built in. Then when the leadership changes to Buddhism, it just gets a little bit more confusing. It starts to break down some of these traditions and structures that had existed for a really long time. So it's one of the reasons why it goes into decline. Their capital city of Angkor, I want to say this correctly because I want you to hear this. It's an amazing fact. The capital city of Angkor was the largest city ever in human history up until industrial London in like the 1800s. What I mean is in size. So we can see from, we can look at kind of the remains of Angkor, and by looking at how much land it covered, not in terms of human population, but in terms of physical size, it's the largest city ever in the world in all of human history until the Industrial Revolution, when London is going to take over that mantle, which is amazing, right? And it might be a city you've never heard of. It might be from a kingdom you've never heard of. They're going to grow really powerful as this really important kind of agricultural state that then is able to trade and assert its power in the region. They eventually come to control a lot of the kind of continental part of Southeast Asia. They fight wars with the Champa state in southern Vietnam. You might know that from Champa rice. They kind of pay tribute to the Song dynasty with Champa rice, which leads to population explosion. Within its boundaries, they're going to have rebellions from the Thai groups that are going to found the Sukhothai state, and eventually the Thai states that come after it in the western part of this territory are going to become one of its main rivals. By the end, they kind of become a tributary state of the Yuan dynasty. So again, this state is existing at the same time as like the foundation of the Majapahit, right? Because the Yuan are going and trying to conquer that island. All of these are going on at the same time, roughly. So again, these are 4 examples in Southeast Asia. There are more states that we could talk about, but really what I wanted us to walk away with is that now we have 2 examples of sea-based empires, 2 examples of land-based empires in Southeast Asia, and hopefully you can kind of pull from those illustrative examples to find evidence that you might need to talk about the rise of these states. So just a friendly reminder that I have way more resources on my website, antisocialstudies.org. Make sure that you're subscribed so that you can see when I post new videos, that you can follow along in your year-end WHAP. And if you're on Instagram, follow me at Antisocial Studies. Great, thanks.